Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm going to start this video by stating a Chinese curse, which goes along the lines of, may he live in interesting times. And I do feel, as a professional negotiator, that I do live in very interesting times. It means I have rather a lot of work. The demand for my sort of skills is rather intense at the moment. And normally I talk about the absolute mess that is Brexit. So it's quite nice to talk about something else in this particular video. And this one I'm going to focus on unions and how they negotiate. Now this is something that's not been in fashion for quite a long time. But with this week's industrial action by the Rail and Maritime Trade Union, I think that's called the RMT at any rate, they have suddenly brought the concept of unionism and collective bargaining and so on back into the forefront of political discussion. So I thought it'd be worth looking into that as a negotiator, what that means and what this week's industrial action actually means, because this is not a straightforward topic. There's lots of nuances at play here, and I thought it'd be interesting to explore that. So for anyone who is new to the channel, I am a professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience, and I like to use this channel to talk about various negotiation related themes. Now I've talked about unions and collective bargaining before, so if you dig out that video from however many months back, please feel free to do so. But let's look into this. Let's look at what union, let's start with what union is. So being part of a union is something that's very much associated with working class sort of demographics. That is not universally true, incidentally. So there's all sorts of different forms of unionism. So yes, you can have the working class, the manual labour type unions, but also you have some very high-end professional class type unions. So the British Medical Association, the Nurses' Council, all those sorts of things. They are in themselves forms of unions, if not outright actually unions. And they perform a whole host of important functions. So I'm going to cover some of that. We'll start with the obvious bit first, of course, and that is collective bargaining. So the whole purpose of the union is to make sure that its members get decent pay, shall we say, and that's very much the hallmark of what the RMT union have been doing in the latest week. So on behalf of their members, they negotiate sort of pay scales across the board, shall we say. And the key hallmark of this collective bargaining is basically you trust your representatives to act on your behalf as a union member. Now there's a bit of a downside to this. The downside to this is that if you as an individual, say, are particularly gifted, and if you feel that as an individual you should be paid more because you are more skilled, more experienced, whatever it may be, then being part of a union and belonging to collective bargaining can actually be a bit of a downside. And this is because the whole point of collective bargainism is to leverage for everybody. It's not really to leverage for individuals. Of course, for collective bargaining to work, that means that everybody has to act together. Otherwise, it all falls apart. So this is the big thing that when we get to the topic of industrial action. The whole point of industrial action is that collective bargaining has not succeeded in driving an agreed outcome and getting the employer to agree or to reach a compromise position with the union in terms of pay, for example. So of course the union then uses the industrial action as, say, leverage in its negotiation. That's fundamentally the purpose of industrial action. But it only works, really, if enough people do it. And this has been one of the hallmarks, one of the difficulties for any union, in that sometimes it feels like they've only got the one big blunt hammer in their toolkit in order to try and force change when it comes to collective bargaining. There's a bit more than that, but that in a bit of a nutshell. Now there are more beneficial reason that don't seem quite so confrontational for being part of a union, and that is collective representation. So when it comes to resolving issues, when it comes to getting messages out and so on, it is far easier for any employer to go to designated representatives to pass the message on, to communicate with them in order to reach, some kind of mutual outcome. So this is one of the benefits of union as well, is that by representing members, it makes communication between the workforce and the high-level employers easier. At least that's what it's meant to do. So, and if there's perhaps maybe a past criticism union, I don't know if it still is, but it only works as well if those that represent the union are competent. And this is perhaps one of the criticisms that can be levelled at many union leaders of the past, in that they were more interested in playing political games than necessarily delivering a competent service for their members. So it's crucial to remember that is again one of the benefits of unionism, but of course it has a weakness in that you rely on the leadership to be decent and competent. Now there's some more bread and butter issues, less confrontational still, on benefits of the union. One of them is the maintenance of standards. So health and safety, workplace standards, so on and so forth, legal stuff, regulatory stuff. The purpose of the union is to make sure that the employer follows the law, but also to make sure that the employees understand what the law is and make sure that they also abide by it. Now I know there's a lot of political messaging and nonsense about things like health and safety and so on, but really this is one of the benefits of unionism, is that, let's say for example, there's a particular industrial mechanical sort of weakness that's at risk of causing harm to people on the factory floor. Those workers may not feel confident enough to raise that issue, to whistleblow that issue to senior management. But what they can do is raise it to the union representative, who will keep them anonymous and themselves raise it to senior management. Now, if that company has good senior management, they will instantly recognise that there is a safety issue and take immediate steps to remedy it. So in that sort of scenario, both the employees and the employers, with the union acting as the middleman, are ensuring good standard, good workplace practices, and so on. That is what's meant to happen. I know it doesn't always, but that is a simple example of the union doing their bread and butter job quite well. They can also be there to deal with conflict. So, and they can be done not only at the group level, when it comes to things like wage bargaining and so on, but also at the individual level. So, for example, any individual employee who might be called up in front of their bosses because of a perceived misdemeanor, complaint, allegation, and so on, they can ask for their union representative to attend that meeting with them, and their role there is not only a bit of independence and scrutiny, but also to make sure that they can address any conflict issues that might arise, ideally to prevent them, but also to resolve them for the benefit of both sides. And then finally, we go to the more controversial part of what unions do, which is political activism. So in the UK, that means that unions quite often have links with the Labour Party, not always, of course, but they quite often will campaign on political issues. Now, this is one of the things that I know is more controversial, including for those who are members of the union. Some people argue that unions should do this and they should be vocal and strident in influencing the setting of government policy. But other people will also argue that unions perhaps are too focused on that and not sufficiently focused on the core issues of looking after the members, preventing conflict in the workplace, maintaining standards, and so on, which are some of the key things that those individuals perhaps want from their union. So just a bit of a reminder, that is what union is meant to be about. So let's focus on what's happening at the moment. What is the RMT doing and why are they striking? Well, there's a very simple political narrative here, which is that is about pay. Well, yes and no. The RMT is a very old union, been around for a long time. And some of the point that they're making, this is not a straightforward pay dispute. And I'll break that down a little bit. So for starters, they're not talking about pay now. And the RMT have been quite clear about that. They have made the point that their members had not had significant pay increases for quite a number of years. So if you assume a normal UK average inflation year of 2% and the RMT get something like 0 or 1% pay increase over a period of 5 years, then of course that means that they are well behind. Their pay in inflationary terms has fallen over that time period. And that is the key message that the RMT is making here. And that has happened to their members. The issue has very much come to the fore right here and right now because inflation is not at 2%. Inflation is predicted to be above 10% in the UK by the end of the year. And none of the rail operators are promising the RMT members pay increases even remotely close to 10%. So that means on top of many years of wage stagnation, they expect the RMT members to take a financial hit this year as well. And so I suppose in that sort of backdrop, it's not really any surprise that when the RMT balloted their members whether they want to take industrial action, there was strong favouritism towards doing just that. So this is the RMT doing their collective bargaining role. And they've sat down and tried to negotiate with the rail operators, and they've not reached a successful outcome. I'll come a bit more onto that in a bit. So, but the important point here is that they've gone for industrial action in order to tackle this wage stagflation issue, which, to be fair, if you've had at least 5 years worth of it, then you can imagine that industrial action becomes your only option if your employer is not going to do anything else about it. But there's other issues, and there always is other issues when there's industrial action involved. And that is about redundancies. And the RMT are fighting against compulsory redundancies. Now, this is where one of the political arguments perhaps comes a little bit to the fore, which is that the rail industry will argue they have to make redundancies because of the tough conditions that has happened in the last few years, particularly with the pandemic. Less people have travelled, less people use the trains. So therefore they have to make cuts. Now I don't believe the RMT is too dogmatic in resisting that for that reason. I think they recognise that the rail industry had difficulties. Unfortunately, there's a lot of political messaging going on. So the argument that the RMT are making back against this is that even though that is true and it is a tough condition, a lot of it is driven by debt. It's driven by the fact that the rail companies are leveraged to the hilt, and that all the bailout that they have received from the government has all gone into paying the debt, which is quite often held by offshore companies, rather than actually back into the railway, rather than to making it sustainable, rather than to protecting jobs and so on. I mean, they've probably got a point there. There's also a political point that the RMT want to make, which is that even though the members are expected to have job cuts, the amount of work that they are meant to do collectively has not decreased. So that means fewer people required to do the same amount of work, and so on, which the RMT says is just not sustainable, it's not really right, and also not good for train safety. Come to the next point. This is the union's role of maintaining standards. Now, I know there's lots of argument about modernisation and so on, but it cannot be denied that many train stations, many trains, do operate a little bit on the margin. You don't have that many human beings in railway uniforms there to deal with trouble. Passengers falling off the platform, for example. A whole bunch of automated systems can only go so far. Fundamentally, you need a human being to be present there to deal with the problem. So this is the sort of toxic mix of issues that is underpinning this industrial action. However, and that all seems vanilla. That all seems quite simple. That seems the sort of stuff that union and their employers tend to get engaged with, and there's a long history of that. But I would argue there's a lot more to this story than that. Something more important, and that is the government. And the government has tried to say that they shouldn't have involvement in this. And in a normal situation, in a normal wage bargaining scenario, that would be correct. It should just be between the union and between the employer to resolve those sort of differences. That is, after all, the whole point. However, you can't take out the government from this issue. Because one of the things that the RMT have pointed out, which is also true, that as a result of the pandemic emergency, the government bailed out the rail operators. And part of the condition of that bailout, that the government then obtained control over those companies. Because they didn't just give away the money for free. They insisted on having a say in certain aspects of how those companies operate. As a consequence of that, the government is a key influencer or a key blocker, depending upon your perspective. The government can refuse to allow the rail operators to increase salaries. They can refuse to provide more money. They can insist the money goes on to servicing debt, for example. All that sort of thing. And this has been part of the accusation that the RMT have levelled here, that this has been the agenda of the government to make sure that they are not paid anymore, and that the money does go, perhaps coincidentally, to those sorts of individuals and companies who might just so happen to be large political donors to the Conservative Party. But of course, that would be a completely unfounded allegation to make, so of course, no truth to that whatsoever. Just coincidence, you might say. So what that means is that this argument, this industrial action, spearheaded by the RMT, is not actually just about wage bargaining. It's going much further than that, and it could potentially trigger into something wider. A whole bunch of other unions are looking at what the RMT are doing, seeing the arguments, and deciding that they themselves have equally valid claims to make against their employers. So the stakes are quite high in this context. And I've jokingly labelled this hearts and minds, because this is fundamentally what you have to remember about industrial action in the UK. If it doesn't involve any media, and if it's a fairly narrow sort of issue, then sure, it is the union doing what the union does, which is argue with the employer about standards, pay, and so on. But when it does become high-profile in the media, and when it does start to challenge the level of government control and the government messaging, then it becomes a political fight. It becomes an ideological dispute, shall we say. So what that means is the unions aren't picking this fight just because they're angry about the pay. They're picking this fight because they're angry at politics as well. And they're trying to remind people that this is the whole point of a union, is to negotiate on others' behalf in order to secure better conditions, better pay, better standards for collective benefit. That is, of course, the messaging. Now, on the other hand, the other side, it's been very striking from particularly the old school Conservatives that they see this as a threat, a bit akin to the miners' strike of the 80s, that the union just want to undermine the Conservative Party, and so in exchange, the Conservative Party need to undermine the unions. and ideologically speaking, both sides are quite adversarial. So perhaps this is the negotiation point that I'm leading towards, that by taking industrial action, the RMT union isn't launching an adversarial, or it isn't leveraging it as an adversarial negotiation with the rail companies. The RMT is launching an adversarial political negotiation with the electorate against the government. And the other unions are likely to follow. And the government, will probably, headed by the Conservative Party, will probably recognise that this is the agenda. And they will be pushing back in all sorts of various ways, curtailing the ability to have ballots. One example that we know of is that they were going to allow rail companies to use agency staff to fill in during industrial action. So what this is, this industrial action, is a resumption of political hostilities, which has been dormant, if you like, for quite a long time. It's very much a defining feature of the late 70s and the early 80s, when it was widely believed that, widely seen that Thatcher fought the miners' unions, arguably won, and suppressed them quite severely, their ability to campaign on union issues. So the question does arise, is are we re-entering that territory? Re-entering a territory when unionism is no longer about fighting for the workers, it's more about political activism and fighting for change at the top of government rather than for change at the top of the employers that they are obviously arguing against. So this is why I think things are going to get very interesting. There's lots of talk of this summer of discontent. And I think the unions are going to be making a play here. And it's important to look at that whatever they put out as the argument, and whatever argument is put back against whatever claims they're making, this is no longer going to be a conversation about are people paid right. There's very much an element of that. But I think, and it's politically speaking, this is interesting. Because in the past, you would have argued perhaps that this would benefit the Labour Party. With its very strong union movement, position of student support, you would have thought that this would benefit Labour in an electoral sense. But that's not a given at this point in time. And so it would be an interesting question as to whether this increased union and industrial activity, industrial action I should say, will help or damage Labour in terms of their re-election prospects. By the same token, for the Conservative Party, it could reinvigorate their adversarial messaging against unions, that they're enemy of good economies and so on. But the current Conservative Party is in a very weak position. They can't argue that the unions have caused economic harm, because quite frankly the evidence is very clearly there that the Conservative Party are the ones causing economic harm. So in that context, many people might look at the unions as people with more answers, more valid answers than the Conservative Party has. So the important point has to be made that although industrial action, increased union activities have been somewhat quiet of late in recent decades, the UK has had 12 years of wage stagnation. And you look at any economic chart that you wish that's credible, and it's very clearly there. And particularly in the last couple of years, price inflation has gone up very significantly. So it's a double whammy of that wage inflation, of that wage stagnation and price inflation. People are really feeling the pinch. And it's a time like this when people start to become quite angry with the politicians that failed them. the leaders that have not looked after their interests. Perhaps also even against their employers who took advantage of the situation and ensured that they didn't give them inflation or above inflation pay rises for many years, because of course that was a cost to the business and they wanted to keep the costs down. And it's all very well making the argument of keeping the cost to business down, but at the end of the day, any advanced economy like the UK relies upon people to have a good wage, because if people don't have a good wage, they can't pay their energy bills, they can't go on holiday, they can't buy whatever it is that companies are making. Companies like Apple and iPhones and laptops, cars, whatever you care to name as a consumer or luxury good, they rely on people to have money spare to spend on those goods. So 12 years of wage stagnation is very bad for an economy as well as bad for the individuals suffering it. And so I think we're entering this realm where inflation and the absolutely abysmal economic performance of the current government, in very testing circumstances, but still abysmal economic performance, has come together. And this creates an opportunity. And the unions have stepped up and said, we're the people who will take advantage, well, not take advantage, the wrong word, but will stand up for others to take this opportunity to advocate on behalf of others. And this is one of the important things about negotiation. As an individual, it can be very hard to negotiate. I mean, for example, me as an individual, how would I argue with the government to change any law? I have no leverage. I have no ability to force them to do that. But if I was negotiating as part of a union, and if the union took a whole host of national damaging strikes that caused the government considerable pain, then that might well force the government to change the law as advocated for. So that is the message that's been put forward. That's the ideology. And of course there'll be the counter-ideology from the Conservative Party who say that union and collective bargaining is bad for the economy. So my final conclusion here, I go back to something I've said many times on this channel. The UK is now in a state of very uncertain change. Brexit was meant to change the UK. Many of the promises made for Brexit were blatantly false, but they were made, and people did believe those promises. As a consequence of the failures to deliver those promises, we have wage stagnation, we have inflation, we have a very angry population who are sick and tired not only of seeing their pay packet going down, but also watching news, seeing the political corruption, and so on. But fundamentally, the underlying what caused Brexit is still there. So whether anyone is from the left or the right or the centre of the political spectrum, and whether they voted for or against something like Brexit, there is definitely a sense that a large number of people in the UK want change, whether that's political change, whether that's economic change or social change. They all have their own reason, they all have the things that they want to see. And so I think we're entering into this sort of transition point where a group of different competing actors, shall we say, will be vying for public attention and arguing they are the ones that can bring that change. Will it be Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party? Will it be the unions? Will it be Keir Starmer under Labour? Will it be other parties? Let's say the Green Party, for example. Or maybe even the likes of the nationalist groups, like, for example, led by Nigel Farage and his Reform UK Party. All of those groups will be pushing forward the message because they know that the UK electorate wants change, any form of change, and they will be trying to promise that they are the one to create that transition, to create the change that people are looking for. And unions are no different. Unions in the past have seen themselves as a force that has leveraged social, economic and political change. And so I sense at this point that they believe the government is weak, and they sense this is an opportunity. They believe Labour is weak as well and will not fight their corner. So they're going to take the matters into their own hand. They're going to use the power of their membership, and they're going to use it to force political and economic conversation to the top of the news agenda. That is what these strikes is about, and that, I think, makes for rather interesting times. So I hope you found this video interesting. I look forward to seeing the comments in the comments box below.